we're going to factor, and we're going to use the concept of greatest common factor. So to start with, let's think about what factoring is. In actuality, factoring undoes multiplication. So if I have the problem 2 times quantity x plus 3, by the distributive property, I multiply 2 times x, we get 2x plus 2 times 3, and we get 6. When we distribute the 2 through in this direction, that's called multiplying. We are going to multiply. Factoring starts with the 2x plus 6 and goes back to where it came from, what product it came from. So when we go backward like this, that's called factoring. So in this direction, we were multiplying. So going back, that's what we call factoring. But the opposite of multiplying, to undo multiplying, we divide. And that's going to be part of the concept. So for example, if I say factor, and I give you the problem 2x plus 6, which I just gave you, we're going to think what number or term divides both of these. And we're looking for what's called the greatest number or term that divides. And in this case, that's called the greatest common factor. This one is fairly straightforward. We see that what's common to 2x and 6, their greatest common factor will be 2. So I'm going to pull a 2 out. Now that I pulled a 2 out, this is how I'm going to think about it. What's going to go in here is I'm going to have a 2x and the 6. And what goes in the parentheses is I'm going to divide by this greatest common factor of 2. 2x divided by 2 gives me an x in here, plus 6 divided by 2 gives me a 3. And that is the factored version of 2x plus 6. Let's try another one also. Suppose I said, for example, given, suppose I said factor, and I'll say factor out the greatest common factor from 4x cubed minus 6x squared. First, I have to identify the greatest common factor. And in this case, the number that divides the 4 and the 6, the largest number that divides both is a 2. And then I have to divide out the x to a power terms. I have an x cubed and an x squared. In order to divide both, I have to use the x squared. So I have 2x squared is the greatest common factor, and I put that in front. Now what I do, that's telling me I'm going to divide the 4x cubed and the negative 6x squared by the 2x squared. In doing that, I divide this by 2x squared. We can see 2 goes into 4 twice. X squared goes into x cubed with just x, so I put a 2x here. Now I take the negative 6x and I divide that by 2x squared, because that was the factor in front. The x squareds will just cancel, and 2 goes into 6. I have a negative 3. And that becomes the factored result. So the way I'm doing this, once I've identified the greatest common factor, I'm just thinking about dividing each of these terms by that greatest common factor to give me what's inside the parentheses. Let's do one that's a little more complicated. So for example, suppose I ask you to factor out the greatest common factor from this expression. We'll be given the polynomial 15x cubed y to the 6th minus 9x to the 4th y to the 4th plus 12x squared y to the 5th. And we want to factor out the greatest common factor. This is going to require a little bit of work finding what we call the greatest common factor. So to do that, I am going to write up the factors of each of these 3 terms of this polynomial. 15x cubed y to the 6 can be thought of. I had a 3 times a 5, and I had 3 x's being multiplied and 6 y's. 4, 5, 6. 9 and x to the 4th, y to the 4th, looking at the next term, is 2 3's, 4 x's, and 4 y's being multiplied. Last term is 12x squared y to the 5th. The factors of 12, well, normally it's 3 times 4, but we put prime factors. So the 4 would be 2 times 2, that's 4 times 3. X squared would be 2 x's and 5 y's. We now have to identify the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor is you put each of these factors the most number of times they occur, the least number of times they occur in each. So what we're looking at, the common factors, we're looking at what's common to all 3 of those. That's why it's called the common factor. So we look at this and we see that in this case there's 2 2's, but there's no 2's here. The only thing common to all of these is a 3, so the 3 gets put down. Then we look at what is common. That's why it's called the common factor. What is common to all of these? They all have one x, then they have another x, and prior to that there's nothing else common to all of them. Then we look, we have one y, and then we have another y, and then we have a third y, and then we have a fourth y, and we'll notice once we have the fourth y, there's nothing else common. So this tells us that our greatest common factor is 3 x times x, x squared, y to the 4th. That's what we're going to factor from each of those terms. So I'll write the problem again. We have 15x cubed y to the 6th minus 9x to the 4th y to the 4th plus 12x squared y to the 5th. And we are going to factor out the common factor, 3x squared y to the 4th. So now what I do is I take each of these and divide them by that greatest common factor. So I rewrite it again. And now I'm ready to divide each of these 3 terms by the greatest common factor. Working this, I see that the first one I have 3x squared y to the 4th. You can see 3 will cancel, gives me a 5. X squared, we get rid of 2 of the x's, just leaves 1x. Y to the 4th with y to the 6th just leaves 2, so it's a y squared. So I am left up here with 5xy squared. Now the second term, negative 9x to the 4th y to the 4th, I divide by 3x squared y to the 4th. I see that 3 goes into that 3. X squared, 2 x's from this makes it x squared. Y to the 4th cancels, so we have minus 3x squared. Now the last one, dividing the 12x squared y to the 5th by 3x squared y to the 4th. The 3 cancels with the 12, makes it a 4. The x squareds cancel, and y to the 4 from y to the 5th gives me 1y. So this becomes plus 4y. And what we're done with, once we've divided out by the greatest common factor, we now have the factored form. We're going to do one that has a different technique around it. I will say factor out the greatest common factor from negative 5x cubed plus 50x squared minus 10x. Looking at this, we can see that the greatest common factor is with the numbers 5, 50, and 10. The one that can divide all of them, and the largest of that is a 5. And then with the x's, we've got an x cubed, x squared, and an x. The only one that will divide all of them is the x. So it looks like the greatest common factor is 5x. When a polynomial leads with a negative, we will factor out negative, the greatest common factor. So in this problem, we are going to factor out not 5x, but negative 5x. That is a convention that we have. So in this problem, we're going to factor out not a positive 5x, but a negative 5x. Now we're going to take negative 5x cubed and positive 50x squared minus 10x. And we're going to divide each of these by negative 5x. And actually, this one, you guys, was just 10x. What happens with this negative divided by negative is positive, and that's the reason we do this. Negative divided by negative is positive. So this becomes a 1, positive 1, and x into x cubed is x squared. So we have an x squared here. Then positive 50 divided by negative 5 is negative 10. X into x squared is x. And then negative 10 divided by negative 5 is positive 2 in the x's. And that would be considered factoring. When it leads with a negative, we're going to factor. And as you notice what happens, it changes all the signs inside. Leads with a negative. Like we have, we factor out a negative. So we factor out a negative, greatest common factor. Here's another one that's a little bit trickier. So for example, suppose I said factor, and I give you the expression 2x squared 3x plus 4 minus 3x plus 4. This one is a little bit tricky because it has parentheses in it. But because it has parentheses with a sign between them, it's not factored. In order for it to be factored, you can't have a plus or minus between terms. So in this one right away, we've got a 2x squared and a 3x. So we can see that the greatest common factor certainly is an x. But the other part of this is we have a 3x plus 4 in both of these. So the 3x plus 4, I'll put a little box around it, is common to both. So it is also part of the greatest common factor. So it's not just x, it's also 3x plus 4. So without rewriting it, I'm going to do the division so you can see what's going to happen. So the greatest common factor will be the x and the 3x plus 4, the x and the 3x plus 4. So factoring this problem, I will have 2x squared times 3x plus 4 minus 3x times 3x plus 4. This is somewhat tricky. The greatest common factor, I put the x and the 3x plus 4, and now I'm ready to divide these, and that's what's going to go in the parentheses. Dividing this, the x cancels with the x squared. I have 2 in the x, and the 3x plus 4 divides evenly and cancels there. So in here, I've got 2x, And now the x cancels with the x. 3x plus 4 cancels, and I've got minus 3. So my factored answer is this. And notice it's factored because everything is being multiplied. There's no pluses or minuses between parentheses. And so this would be factored form.